Hi, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for February 2022. This roundup starts out a little differently because Ukraine stories in this roundup are taken from an excellent post by Alex Schwartzman at Future Science Fiction Digest. And this post is called A List of Ukrainian-born SFF authors whose fiction is available in English. It includes both short fiction and novels. Now, some of these stories are from several years ago and some are newer, but they're all excellent reads. And like I said, I've picked 5 stories from that post to start off this roundup. The first story is Things We Leave Behind by Alex Schwartzman in Daily SF. Schwartzman himself describes this story as a semi-autobiographical story about emigrating from Ukraine to the USA. It's a quiet, wistful story, resonating with hints of magic that may or may not be real. And it explores the thorny, painful issues within a family caught up in a changing world as the Soviet Union comes to an end. The pain of leaving a place and the excitement of coming to a new world, and the way each family member is affected in a different way by this comes through clearly and sharply. My next story pick is 7 Losses of Na-Re by R.B. Lemberg, also in Daily SF. Now, I love Lemberg's work, but I had never read this story by them, and it's from 2012. It's beautiful, threaded through with grief and pain, but also so much love and memory. There's a world that was lost, people who were lost. And there are words and names and languages that can no longer be spoken. Breathtaking prose, gorgeously, painfully wrought story of some of the darkest sides of European and Soviet history. My next story pick is The Emperor of Death by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko, translated by Julia Matov-Hersey from Future Science Fiction Digest. Now, this is a chilling, compelling science fiction story that twists slowly, inexorably into quiet, almost unspoken horror toward the end. It's about Dennis, who was born on a long-distance space expedition. One by one, everyone else on the expedition died under mysterious circumstances. And eventually the orphaned boy came back to Earth, but death still haunts him, and now 3 of his teachers have all died. Alexander has been sent to investigate, but ends up finding out more than he bargained for. And my next story pick is Kulturkampf by Anatoly Belilovsky at Cast of Wonders, narrated by Hans Fenstermacher. Now, I absolutely love this totally bonkers steampunk/alt history story where music is used as a weapon of war and where some major European conflicts are played out by instruments and orchestras. The audio version is priceless and a real treat for the soul. My next story picks is Animals of Uray by Darina Stremetska in Three Crows magazine and is translated by Maxim Bakalov. This is about Ariel and Greg, who have been sent to the planet of Uray by His Majesty Ludwig, and they're tasked with bringing back capybaras, animals that the king wants to put in the zoo. Ariel isn't totally comfortable with this task, but disobedience is unthinkable, so he and Greg set off to complete their work as quickly as possible. Things take a turn as soon as they meet one of these capybaras, a creature that turns out to be a lot different than they expected. And I love how this story quietly twists in the telling, and the ending is very satisfying. In addition to these Ukrainian stories, stories by Ukrainian or Ukrainian-born writers, I also want to boost the work of SFF writer Karolina Fedik. They are part of a Polish volunteer organization called Letyaha, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, which means flying squirrel, and they work to transport Ukrainian refugees from the Polish-Ukrainian border to Krakow. And I really wanted to recommend you read this wonderful story by Fedik in Fireside Fiction. It's called Your Inheritance Will Taste of Salt. Now, this is a very different kind of Selkie story and a different kind of witch story. It takes the elements of fairy tale and folklore and weaves something new from those threads. There's a fierceness and a sharpness to the characters in the story and their relationships that makes this story really special. My next story pick is Small Offerings for a Small God by Virginia Moller in Luna Station Quarterly. This is a devastating, quietly powerful story about a very small godling and a warrior that has been cursed to walk back and forth across a desert in her armor until she dies. What happens between these two characters when they meet changes them both. And in her exquisite prose, Moller captures so much in what is both said and left unsaid. Exploring the complexities of guilt and pain, arrogance, redemption, and the Nature Quarterly blog that I link to on at Maria's reading in the version of this roundup there, so you can check that out. My next story pick is My Cloak of Keys by Fran Wilde in The Deadlands. In a desolate place where the dead end up after they pass, someone gathers the needs and wants of those dead, the needs and wants they still cling to, and carries them in the form of keys. Sometimes there are glimpses of the world of the living that comes to the carrier of the keys, where they can also see what the dead so desperately cling to sometimes after death. And sometimes the gatherer of the keys slips back into the world of the living to finish some of the tasks the dead could not. But crossing from the land of the dead back into the world of the living is both difficult and dangerous. And when someone sets a trap, the holder of the keys walks into it. Wilde's story is both fierce and heartbreaking, and I love the mixture of beauty and brutality here, and the vividly imagined land of the dead, and the echo through this tale. My next story pick is 3 Songs to Fill Up the Shadow by Spencer Ellsworth in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. Now, this riveting and finely crafted novelette is structured as several tales told within the main tale, and all of them, in one way or another, concern death, a golden fiddle, and the woman who played that fiddle. Ellsworth's prose is an absolute delight, and the language gives this tale such texture and depth, building the world from the words and voices of the passengers on a very strange ferry. They are all crossing the water for a purpose, but that purpose only becomes clear to us as they each tell their stories. My next story pick is Bonsai Starships by Yoon-Ha Lee in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. By Yoon-Ha Lee is a must-read as far as I'm concerned, and this one is a perfect weave of fantasy and science fiction, which makes sense since it's from the science fantasy issue of a novice named Kay who serves at the shrine where bonsai starships are grown. And she must make a terrible choice when she finds out what will happen to the growing bonsais in her care. I love how each growing bonsai starship has its own will and personality in the story, and I love how Kay's love for the plants in her care is what drives her to make some radical decisions. My next story pick is my third story pick from Beneath Ceaseless Sky, and it's Blood Grains Scream in Memories by Jason Sanford. Now, I fell in love with Jason Sanford's Blood Grains world in his first story set in the Storyverse. It was called Blood Grains Speak Through Memories, and it's from 2016. The Blood Grains world was once, far in the distant past, ravaged by humans until the existence of all life was threatened. A solution to this problem was found, but it completely changed the world. Radical nanotechnology was used to turn some people into anchors that would care for and viciously defend, essentially ruled by the blood grains. It's a fascinating world populated by strange and fascinating characters, and Blood Grains Scream in Memories is the finale to what is essentially a mosaic novel. The two other stories that complete this series are The Emotionless in Love and Where the World Ends Without Us, and I highly recommend you read this entire series of stories. My next story pick is The Third Feather by Fatima Takvi in Tasavvur. This is just an exquisite tale, wonderful to read, about Gigi, who as a child, or was it really a bird? She helped the bird escape from a viper. As thanks, the mother bird gave Gigi 3 of its feathers, and whenever she burns one of those feathers, a wish is granted. Now, 2 of the feathers have helped bring fortune and favor at the royal court to Gigi and her husband, but 1 feather still remains. This story has palace intrigue, magic and ambition, motherhood, love, and dreams, and Takvi masterfully spins all these threads into a mesmerizing story. Gigi's life changes each time a feather is burned as the magic twists her life in a new direction, but in the end, she finds a different path altogether. My next story pick is Oversharing by R.J. Theodore in Fireside Fiction. I won't say much about this. It's flash, it's tiny, it's brilliant, it's body horror, and there's a transformation here that leads to hunger, cell phone problems, and then pursuit of desire. It's dark, twisted, and glorious. My next story pick is Telling the Bees by Kat Howard in The Sunday Morning Transport. This is about a woman who has become a witch, living in the woods, growing flowers for the bees that make her honey. She speaks to the bees, and in turn, the bees speak to her. Their honey is sweet, the bees love her until a man enters her life. And even though she is a witch that has helped others get away from bad men and bad relationships, it takes her too long to understand what this man is doing to her, to the bees, and to others. Howard's story is beguiling and beautiful, and it incorporates all sorts of lore and magic concerning bees. I especially love the way the witch eventually in a truly appropriate manner. My next story pick is Delivery for 3C at Songview by Marie Croak in Diabolical Plots. This is about Dana Utepi, who works as a dasher, delivering food to people all over the city. But she is also a descendant of a jinn, which ends up causing her both minor and major headaches when people speak their wishes in her vicinity. Croak spins that setup into a most delicious and enjoyable, reluctant, awkward romance of sorts that has more than one twist along the way. My next story pick is Human Body as Compendium by Mary Berman in Pseudopod Flash on the Borderlands. It's narrated by Suna Dasi. This is a flash fiction story that is part of an excellent Flash on the Borderlands episode at Pseudopod. And in this story, visceral body horror fills every sentence and paragraph, but the real horror is Berman's story is deeply unsettling and disturbing and sharp as a knife's edge. To quote the writer, "In moments of high anxiety, I like to imagine that I can crack my skull open and take my brain out and put it somewhere else for a while." This story carries this impulse to its natural conclusion. My second story pick from this Flash on the Borderlands episode is Never Enough Pockets by Kat Day, narrated by Catherine Inskip. Now, this story is just such a glorious and feral tale of rage and of how to turn anger into power and action and righteous vengeance. To quote the website, Never Enough Pockets is inspired by both what happened to Sarah Everard and the shocking conduct of the police during the subsequent vigil on 13th of March 2021. Now, my next story pick is Hold You by Angela T. Gardner in Cast of Wonders, narrated by Barry Deutsch. This is an absolutely delightful and compelling tale about Oscar, who is a very clever octopus, clever enough to outsmart Dr. Labcoat as he sets in motion Operation Puddle Jump in a quest for freedom and romance. I love everything about the story, from its sly humor to its madcap escape plans and to the way a coffee maker plays a pivotal role. My next story pick is Babang Luksa by Nicasio Andres Reed in Reckoning. Now, the title of the story refers to a Filipino funeral custom that takes place on the first anniversary of a death. And in this story, this custom is what brings Gino back home to his family a year after the death of his father. Reed tells a quietly powerful story about family and grief and regret, all set in a not-too-distant future where the waters are rising everywhere, changing and submerging the world as they rise. I love the prose. I love the subtle ways that Reed captures both the intricacies and conflicted emotions of complicated family relationships. And I love the various ways the changing climate impacts not just the world, but life on a personal neighborhood level. My next story pick is Full Worm Moon by Paul Laurello in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the January-February issue. This is an unsettling tale of a strange clan of creatures living at the edge of the regular world, haunting the cemeteries on certain nights to consume the worms that come out of the graves. What happens to them after eating the worms is a deep, dark kind of magic that makes them assimilate some of the memories and knowledge of the dead. For one of them, his first time in the graveyard upends his whole life and shed identity behind. This is a devastating tale of someone at the edge between adolescence and adulthood, humanity and monstrosity, and the search for a life. My next story is also from the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and it's Proximity Games by M.L. Clark. It's another fantastic story from this issue. Clark tells a complex and compelling story of humans and aliens, of humans leaving Earth and the conflicted choices they must make in the process, and the new challenges and conflicts, internal and external, that await them on their new home planet. And I love the way a scene from the beginning of the story with a fawn echoes through the story. And I love how Clark explores the many complexities of relationships and families and societies, and how we approach new forms of life and new ways of living. My next story pick is two stories from it's Stone Ghosts and Your Punishment Is. Both are by D. Booth, and they're from their short story collection, Making Friends and Other Fictions. Now, I just finished reading this excellent collection of excellently strange short stories, and I highly recommend the whole thing. But these two stories are two of my favorites. Stone Ghosts is a love story. It's also a mystery story and a noir-edged coming-of-age story, all told in the space of a short story. Booth captures adolescent love, rebellion, family tension, and the feeling of being trapped in a place that won't allow you to be yourself, whoever that may be. To quote the story, you can fall into stride with the city, but you can't outrun it. You can't tame it or befriend it. It's looking for ways it can use you to live. Your Punishment Is, which is the other short story I picked from this collection, is a harrowing and bloody tale of a man captured in the act of killing someone. However, when his captors decide to hang him on the spot, things take a very strange turn, And I love how Booth twists the tale at the end. As in all the stories in this collection, Booth weaves a gripping story that hooks you from the first sentence to the last. My next story pick is The Last Truth by Anna Maria Curtis at Tor.com. This story was the first place winner of the LeVar Burton Reads Writing Contest, which was co-presented by Faya Literary Magazine and Tor.com. And it is a fantastic tale of memory and identity, love and desperation. And to quote the description of the story, a runaway and indentured thief, Ari must provide a new secret to open each new lock at the cost of her own memory. Hundreds of locks later, Ari can barely recall her own past. An unanticipated alliance with a musician may prove the key to both their freedoms, if Ari doesn't lose herself in the process. So in the story, Ari cracks open truth locks, magical locks that require a truth you've never told anyone else in order to open. And since each truth told is consumed in the process and disappears from her memory, she is losing her past and herself bit by bit. When she meets Ania, a musician, there's a glimmer of both love and hope for both of them. But to gain her own freedom and find the lost instrument Ania is looking for, Ari must risk everything she has and everything she is. This story kept me on the edge of my seat, and I love its mixture of bitter desperation and hopeful warmth. My final story pick for this month's roundup is Annunciation by P. Akasaka in Strange Horizons. Now this, I'll read a bit of the story. The archangel told me I was chosen, expecting. I thought a little and answered, I couldn't give my consent. The power balance was such I could not ascertain whether there was an element of coercion involved. That sort of thing is really bad news for a relationship, I told him. I know better than that now. So in this story, a woman is told by an archangel that she will become pregnant, that she's pregnant, but not with a child, but with a language. Akasaka's serial story is brilliantly sharp and darkly funny, with an edge that cuts deep as it explores the intricacies in the usage and creation and loss of languages, weaving in both pain and resistance and a measure of body horror in the process. And those are all my stories for this month's roundup. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next month.